So I think, yeah, that's us. All right, we're going. So good afternoon. Thank you for coming. This workshop is about academic language, and I appreciate you being here. There's a sign-in sheet going on that side, and there's a sign-in sheet going along this side. And so just try to find one. Some of you, I think, are getting credit for coming for your classes. I hope that you'll get more than just credit out of coming today. So my name is Terryl Rock, and a lot of you know me, and for that I apologize, and some of you don't, but you're going to, and for that I apologize. But I am the new edTPA coordinator here at ETSU. I've been here for a while, though. I've been the secondary ed clinical instructor, and I still am. So today we're going to talk about academic language. And the thing about academic language that's confusing is that, first of all, I think it's getting over misconceptions about academic language. And it's focusing on things that most of us have not focused on before. So when I first prepared this presentation, I thought about calling it Academic Language for Dummies. But since I was going to present it at Southeastern Regional Conference, Dr. Keith talked me out of that. So I don't know, maybe she didn't think that I was really showing any kind of academic language by calling it Academic Language for Dummies. But when I first began this journey and with edTPA, this was the thing that stumped me the most. And as I got into it, I would go to workshops and I would find myself more confused when I left than when I went in. And I realized that it really had to do with some misconceptions I had about what academic language was. So we're going to just start at the very beginning and go through it. And for those of you who are here and you're instructors, this is the way I teach it in my class. We're going to go through, I'm going to show you the method that I use, and we're going to go through that method. So those of you who are here that are student teachers or are going to be student teachers, this is exactly the way I do it to my students. So you'll be getting that lesson. Academic language. So it's really the difference between informal and formal language. So if I'm texting, that's about as informal and casual as I can get, because I might not even bother to spell words correctly. I might put a lowercase I in a text, and I would never do that in any other type of language. This goes all the way through to where you're doing very formal language. Perhaps you are writing a research report. The other day I had people turn in an assignment in class, and it was their context for learning, and I looked at it and I gave it back to them and I said, you have to write complete sentences. Because when you are doing things that are formal, you write in a formal way, and that's part of it. So we have a continuum of our speech from very conversational all the way up to very formal. There are 5 language skills in a classroom. You've got listening and speaking, reading and writing, and performing. I've got to pass these out.
I'll do it.
Sorry. I'm seeing people take notes and I'm thinking, oops.
Lauren, I'll do it.
Yes, I'm sorry. Thank you very much. Listening and speaking, reading and writing, and performing. Do you think that happens in every classroom? Is it happening today? Are people speaking and listening? Folks, this is not a trick question. Just nod your head. Do you hear language going on? All right, yes, there's language going on. There's always language going on. No one is going to a silent classroom unless it's a classroom for the deaf, and then they're using sign language. So there's always a way that we're trying to communicate with one another. That's how we teach. We have receptive skills and we have expressive skills. Which of these are receptive of those 5? Listening and reading. And which are expressive? speaking, writing, performing. In a classroom, we want students to practice both. We want them to practice the receptive, and we want them to practice the expressive. But the edTPA is mainly interested in seeing how you support, instruct, and assess students' expressive and productive language. In other words, how you help students with their speaking, their writing, their performing. These often yield some sort of product. Now, when I was looking at how I have been teaching academic language, I was teaching it the way it appears in our prompts and the way it appears in our lesson plan. So in our lesson plan format, the first thing you do in that academic language section is to identify the function. Well, I'm going into a class of students that are just kind of like real fuzzy about academic language. They know it's people speaking in a formal way about their content in their class. And I say, what's the function? And you can imagine what I get. What do I get? We're going to love this expression. Yeah, you can imagine the faces I get. They don't know what the heck I'm talking about. Even if I give them the definition of function. So I don't start with function. What I do, I looked back at the material that's comes with our edTPA stuff, and it says that academic language demands are so embedded in instructional activities that you may take them for granted. So it's important for students to examine learning tasks. Does examine mean the same thing as plan? No. Examine means we look at it afterwards. We look at it after it's planned, Consider what language your students need to understand, communicate, and perform. So this got me thinking, maybe I'm going about it the wrong way. Examine learning tasks. Identify particular language demands in relation to chosen learning tasks, and plan and describe instructional supports that help students. So again, identify the language demands, plan and describe. So I'm being asked to examine and describe. This makes me think that perhaps what I need to do is have them write their lesson plan and then analyze the academic language that is in their lesson. So it's a backward design, and it works. So, just again, 2 important points. Can you teach without academic language? No. You're not teaching if that's what you've got. You have academic language. That's what's going on. It's occurring in your lesson anyway. What you need to do as students is to examine the academic language and analyze the academic language in your lesson. What if you discover that you have not given enough attention to vocabulary? Then you can add that in that planning part. If you discover you haven't added in enough supports, you can add that in. But as far as how we instruct the students, starting with a function doesn't work very well. And this is why they're often confused. So we have a backward design, a contextual approach, and where we have the demands. This is something else that got me confused. People talked about language demands, and to me, that was receptive expressive in my brain. And that was one of the misconceptions I had to get over. When they talk about language demands in edTPA, they're talking about function, vocabulary, syntax, and discourse. And for the poor old secondary math people, mathematical precision. So that's what they mean. Early childhood handbooks only address vocabulary, and SPED does communication. So the ways that students write about academic language is not the way we should teach it. So when we teach it, I don't know how to get this thing back the way, does anybody know how to fix that?
I had IT come adjust it, and they said they fixed it, and obviously they did not.
Yeah.
All right, let me see what I can do. You go.
And it's not going to do it on the tape, but still it's annoying for me. So what we often do is that we try to teach it the way that we have.
Better?
Yes, thank you so much. What did you do?
I'll show you later.
Okay, thank
I
you.
pushed the button.
You are a genius, Dr. Hogan. It's a genius.
Thank you.
She knows more about stuff than I'm ever going to know, and she's forgotten more than I'm ever going to know.
Thank you, my dear.
So identify language function. This is how we ask students to write about it in your lesson plans and in the edTPA. Identify the language function. Then we have you identify the learning task. Then we have you describe the other language demands, and then describe the supports. But I can tell you that as an instructional approach, this is confusing for students. Instead, start with the backward design. Start with the product. Ask the students, what is your key language task? Look at your lesson. What was the key language task? What was a final language product? What was the purpose of that task and product? And based on that product, purpose, is it syntax or discourse? Once they've figured that out, then you can help them understand what function, what they are doing with their brain. The students, what they are asking the students, demanding the students do with their brain. You can write a language objective and figure out what vocabulary is needed. So this is how I take my students through it. And most of them get it the first time. Just about, if you have any teaching experience, you know that you can't get 100% mastery with any one lesson. Usually takes at least 3. And then how you want to help the students use the academic language. So I found that to be a much more beneficial way to instruct. And that's what we're looking at today. So the basic questions, we have steps. Step 1. Step 1 in determining the syntax or discourse, first of all, you have to say, what is the key language task? So you're looking at your lesson plan, you're thinking about all the things that you've done, and you think, what is the key language task? And once you've looked at that task, what's the final language product? What's the purpose? We're going to practice this in a minute. And based on the purpose, is that syntax or discourse? Now, definition. Definition of the purpose of discourse, definition and purpose. So the discourse is how members of a discipline talk, how they write, how they participate in knowledge construction, and how they use structures of written and oral language. So if you want your students to speak and write like historians, or speak and write like mathematicians, or like artists, your essential question is, what's the purpose of the product? So if it's an essay, what's the purpose? Is it for them to show that they know how to write an essay? Or is there some content that you're asking them to express in the essay? Is it to use the structures of written and oral language in order to communicate content? Or is the purpose of the purpose of discourse is to communicate content? So if the purpose is to write a paragraph or an essay about a content, we're talking discourse. So it comes down to purpose. Syntax. Syntax has to do with rules. Rules for organizing words, symbols, putting them together in phrases, clauses, sentences, visual representations. But what gets people stuck is the fact that we're always using rules. But the difference is, are rules the focus of your activity? Or is the content the focus of the activity? Are you looking to see how well the students apply the rules? Or are you looking to see how well they can communicate the content? That's where the difference comes in. So your essential question is, what is the purpose of the product? Is the focus on the structures themselves? Like grammar. You're having students write, show what the linking verbs are, the helping verbs. They still call them helping verbs?
Most of the time.
I didn't know if they'd come up with another fancier term or not. The purpose of a syntax activity is for students to correctly use structure or rules. So when you take vocabulary and you put it with structure, if you stop here, you're talking about the syntax. If the purpose of your activity is for students to use new vocabulary and put it in a structure, and the whole point is for them to correctly use that structure, you're looking to see, can they write a 5-paragraph essay? Or are you asking them to communicate a content by using vocabulary, correct structure? But by using those things, we have content. So we go from bricks, structure, because you know what happens if these aren't laid correctly, and you put it all together in a design, final product. That's discourse. If it's your purpose for students to use vocabulary and structure to come up with a final product, then we're talking discourse. This gets easier. Hang in there. Look at these. We've got letter, paragraph, artist statements, lab reports, speeches, essays, interpreting graphs, examining elements of a play, writing a review, describing the elements of playing a sport. Do these communicate content or focus on structure? Content. They communicate content. If it communicates content, then they're examples of what? What? Discourse. Communicating content is discourse. But what if it's not about the letter, but it's about a letter format? You want your students to show that they can write. Do they still do this in elementary school? Teach students how to write friendly and business letters? They should, if they're not. And paragraph structure. So if the purpose is for them to show that they can write show a good structure to their paragraph, mathematical sentences, Punnett squares, grammar, punctuation, these things within a sentence, if you're looking at their ability to show transition phrases, independent, dependent clauses, cues for PE, musical notation, chord progression, longitude and latitude for location. What are they doing here? With these products, what are they doing? They are focusing on the rules and structure. And so, communicating content, all of these would be examples of product, and all of these would be examples of syntax. Now, this is the problem. This is where we get into a real problem. Because everybody wants things to be one thing or another. And they're not. Things are not one thing or another. So if you have graph, a graph could be discourse or it could be syntax, depending on what?
The purpose.
What's that?
Function.
That's right, the function, your purpose. You're good. You're a step ahead of everybody. Good for you. Yes. It has to do with how you're going to use it. Are the students going to interpret it? Because if they're interpreting the graph, what is it? Discourse. But what if they're going to identify or apply? Then what kind of thing are we getting into? It has to do with rules, doesn't it? So now we're talking syntax. So you can't just have a magical answer. And this is one thing that is really great about the edTPA I like, because there aren't any magical answers. You have to support and defend your answers. If you're saying that your use of a graph in this lesson is discourse, you can defend that position by saying it's a graph because we're interpreting it and talking about it. And that's discourse. If they're creating the graph using some rules and the point of the lesson is the rules, you can say that it's syntax. So that brings us to looking at this. Students have been studying the causes of the Civil War. They have created research and will now use the 5-paragraph structure to write an essay. The teacher will be assessing the students' knowledge of the causes of the Civil War. Is that discourse or syntax?
Discourse.
And you compare it to this one. Here, the same thing. Students have read a nonfiction piece on the causes of the Civil War. The teacher has been reviewing the structure of the thesis statement and now asks students to apply their new skill in addressing this content. This is syntax. Why? Why is this one syntax? Who's going to be brave and raise their hand?
Because they're talking about reviewing the structure.
Excellent. Very good. That's exactly right. Because the point is the structure. Very good. Thank you for being a risk taker. Do not use both discourse and syntax. Now, I realize that there could be both discourse and syntax in a lesson, but there's a lot of good reasons not to identify both in your lesson. First of all, it's not going to do you any good. You can only mess it up. It's not going to improve your score, but it could threaten your score as far as the ETSU. The prompt says syntax or discourse, and if you look carefully at the rubrics, they are looking for you to identify one or the other. Describing both does not give you any more points. Describing both, though, does increase your chances of misidentifying. And that could get you a 1. So you don't want to misidentify, because if you misidentify, that shows that you don't understand about academic language. And a strict score would give you a 1 on that rubric. Or might. I don't really think that's likely, but I do think they might give you a 2 for sure. Often the activity that the student believes is syntax is really not syntax, it's a support. For example, you've done a Venn diagram and you have compared and contrast two things like Mussolini and Hitler, right? And you've got how they're alike and how they're different. And if I was going to have my history students do a Venn diagram on Hitler and Mussolini, where am I probably going with that? What? You think I'm just going to stop with the Venn diagram?
A little short essay.
I want to have them write an essay, right. So the final product is not the Venn diagram. The Venn diagram is not the final product. You're always thinking, well, what's next? What comes? The purpose of the Venn diagram is for them to organize their thoughts for the essay. So the final product is the essay. And that's how people get this confused. They think, well, we did a Venn diagram. Yeah, but the Venn diagram had another purpose, a greater purpose. So, your turn. Are you ready? You get to use help with your partners next to you. We're going to go through this together. It makes more sense once you start doing it. Yes, you do that side, I get this side.
I know, she said it's gonna
Okay, Dr. Keith wants to remind supervisors to go by and pick up their business cards, and she's got a holder for them. So, all right. We're going to work on this together. Do not work ahead. Do not work ahead, because you're going to work with partners. You may be smart, and that's good, but you're going to help people around you that are struggling. All right. This is your academic language worksheet. Now, I know some of you all are elementary, and some of these things don't make these maybe don't seem like a content to you. Elementary, don't worry so much about picking a content, but you could think about, for instance, are you teaching? What are you teaching them? Maybe it's not science class, or maybe it's not a history class, but maybe you're teaching them how to write a paragraph, or how to do a certain type of math problem. So think about what you're teaching. This is your content. Now, if you're having trouble thinking about what you could be content, you can look back at the part of this right here, this part of your packet, because there's a lot of suggestions, or you can use what I've got, one of those there. I will tell you that you don't have to use an elementary example to be able to apply what you learn from this, even if you choose life cycle butterflies. It'll help. So I want you, with a partner, to choose one of these contents or write one of your own in the blank.
I think we all know.
Maybe.
Okay, Mr. Smith, what did your group choose?
My group chose Great Depression.
Chose Great Depression. What did you all choose, Miss Lyons?
We were creative and we did women's right to vote.
Okay, great. Now, within the context of that content that you've just come up with, think about a language product that would fit. Look at these, or look at the ones that are in your packet, and think of a language product that would fit for that content, and circle one, or write one. Logan, what did you and your partner choose?
Cues for bowling.
Cues for bowling. Miss Treese, what did you all choose?
We choose life cycles of butterflies and artist statements.
Artist statements. Okay. And what did you all choose, Miss Whitson?
The Great Depression, and we chose an essay.
Good. Okay. What you have done is you have identified the language product of a key learning task. Now, students, when you're writing your lesson plan, wait until you've written the whole plan. Then go back to your academic language section and think, what was my key language task? How did we use language, or how am I planning to use language in this lesson? Don't try to plan it. Examine, analyze, and describe. Okay? Now, thinking about what you're going to do here. Let's say you have a lab report that you're going to write. Who decides what the purpose of the lab report is? Teacher. Teachers think they have no freedom, and actually they have freedom all day long. They're always deciding the purpose of what they're doing. And no one knows that purpose but you. You're the one that decides when you assign a lab report whether it's to communicate the results of the experiment or if it's to demonstrate that they understand how to apply the rules that you've asked for. What you have to do in the edTPA is be able to explain why you believe something to be what it is. You cannot just say this is discourse, because it's always discourse. It's discourse, it's discourse, it's discourse. Just like this is black, this is white, this is clearly orange. But not UT. Don't like it. It's orange because it's one of God's gifts. The world is orange. And I can wear it without being a UT fan. So, that is what you have to decide. What is the purpose? So look at what you chose as your product and decide, is the purpose of your product to correctly use structure? Are you focusing on rules and structure? If yes, this is what? Syntax. Is your purpose for students to use vocabulary and structure to come up with a final product? So, are you focusing on communicating content? If yes, this is what? Discourse. Now, I will tell you that most of the time, even scores for the edTPA think of things as certain things. Like they're always going to think of a speech as discourse. Even though, actually, if the purpose of your activity was to show elements of a speech, it would be syntax. So you do need to be aware that you can start getting real risky. You better be ready to make a good argument as to why something is syntax when it's usually considered discourse.
There's a problem with the grammar and punctuation thing. I don't know if this applies to elementary literacy, but if secondary English language arts people pick that, I steer them away from it because it's real hard to meet their subject-specific emphasis.
Yes.
And it's real hard to explain that, well, I had this one little thing. So I would steer away from that. And I don't know elementary literacy is that.
They need to steer away from
It's the same
syntax.
thing. It's the
Really,
same
they
thing.
do. Discourse is a better language function for you to be using because it's going to cause more interaction and more discussion, and that's what Task 2 is all about.
I have a question. When you're looking at early elementary and let's talk about a Venn diagram for a second. And they're just learning how to compare and contrast.
Then the purpose is to learn how to use the Venn diagram.
And then
So it's what?
syntax.
That's correct.
Okay.
Always has to do with the purpose. So whenever you're unsure, you go back to that question. What's my purpose? What's my instructional purpose in this activity? Anytime, students, when you question, and instructors, when students come to you with this question, is it syntax or discourse? You come back with them with another question. What's that question?
What's the purpose?
What's the purpose? Yes.
Is it in any way linked to the standard? Like, if your standard is to write an essay, it would be syntax.
Everything you do should be linked to your standard, yeah. So you need to look at your standard and see where you're going. But sometimes people use a standard in order to build off into something greater, to a different level of blooms. So be aware of that too. Okay. So this is step 2, when we identify a language function. That's what somebody back there already knows, Dr. Ward, very good. So you have vocabulary, syntax, and discourse. And when you put those together, these are tools that you use to accomplish a language function. Function. People like to say use Bloom's verbs, and I don't really have a problem with that, except that the list of Bloom's verbs, I've seen a bunch of different lists, and some of them just have the actual verbs themselves, remembering those aren't enough. And then others have all these others, and what they've listed is a bunch of performance verbs. And see, that's what you've got to avoid. Performance verbs. So a lot of my students in secondary ed, they want to say demonstrate understanding. Matter of fact, please take demonstrate understanding out of your vocabulary and never write those words together again, because it really isn't a very good objective. What is it you want them to do? What is it you want them to think when we're talking about function? What do you want them to do with their brain? And I got this from Miss Whitson. She came to my class one time a few years ago, and she says, what's going on in their brain? And at the time, I didn't put it all together. And that's why I'm saying, you just have to use this and practice this, and it eventually comes to you. But what is going on in their brain? You don't want to use verbs that imply performance, such as solve. Solve is a mathematical function. It cannot be used as a language function. They even say that in the understanding rubric level progression very clearly. Demonstrate, write, read. Even though reading is what they're doing, we're asking what has to go on in their brain. Maybe interpret, maybe synthesize. So all of these things are things that you do in your brain. They're language functions. So you try it. I want you to look at what you're going to do. You have decided the purpose of your product. Now circle a language function. This is on your academic language handout. Okay. Let's take these young ladies up here. What did you all choose as your product?
like we talked about, we didn't have enough time to really talk about.
Okay, I'll give everybody another minute. Let's get it done. Decide what you want to do. I'm sorry, I didn't realize I didn't have to do this.
When you say
That's exactly what I would choose.
Okay.
But if you want to do something, that's fine. Because they're gonna have to see, they're gonna have to think in that brain.
Like everything, right?
Especially when you're talking about younger children, they have to think about what comes first and what comes last. Those are all important things that they learn. It doesn't seem very simplistic for us because we're adults, but for a child, that's actually okay. All right. So, are you ready? I'm going to ask everybody. I'm not going to be picking on just one group this time. What's your product?
Our product is a lab report.
Lab report, and what's your function?
We use describe and analyze and summarize.
One function. You got to, I didn't say that. I thought it was, I just assumed it was there. One, you got to have one. Summarize. Okay. How about you all?
We chose interpreting graphics and we use sequence.
Okay. So interpreting graphs, sequence. Okay. What do you all have? Not interpret? Interpreting graphs, I think, would be
Graphics. So I guess like for the life cycle.
okay. So you're talking about the life cycle, and they're going to come up with a graph that they make.
Well, it just says graphics, so I guess like
What would you have them do?
sequence like in order the phases.
So what do they do? Their brain is sequence, like we talked about. What about you all? What did you choose?
We also chose, so for the life cycle of the butterfly, interpreting graphics, and we were kind of thinking like a flow chart.
So their function, if you're going to have them interpreting graphics, what's their function? Interpret. Yeah. It's there. Yeah. What are you all doing?
We had lab report and we said identify, if we could identify the different stages of the life cycle.
Good. What about you all?
We had interpreting graphics.
Okay. Did anybody not use interpreting graphics? Okay, what did you all do?
Lab report.
Lab report, and what'd you do?
Analyze.
Analyze, great. And how about Ms. Whitson's group?
We said summarize 3 main events leading up to the Great Depression.
Okay, very good. All right, so their language function. Yes, I should have told you that you only choose one. That doesn't mean that you're not doing more than that, but you're choosing the function, one function, because describing more than that is not something you want to get into doing. I can guarantee you. It's going to be enough just to talk about that one. All right. Write your language objective. Now, to write language objective, all you're going to do is say the learner will put in your function, then put in your syntax or discourse. The learner will model the cues. The learner will locate points on a map using longitude and latitude. I don't really like that one. The learner will apply Punnett squares to discover offspring genotypes. The learner will identify parts of speech. The learner will explain the differences between a food chain and a food web in a paragraph. The learner will interpret a story map. The learner will create a work of art. So it's just a very simple sentence structure. The learner will function, syntax, or discourse. Write your language objective. Now, what I have my students do in their lesson plan where it says language function, I have them write their language objective and underline the function. So let me say that again. In your lesson plan template, there's a part for you to write your language function. And I like for my students to write a language objective and underline the function, because then they have a better focus for that academic language section of their lesson plan. Okay. What do you notice about the verbs here and the verbs here? And this kind of goes to what Dr. Hogan was getting at. Here's your hint.
I feel like the discourse seems more opinionated on that.
Yeah, more open-ended. Very good. Excellent. That's exactly right. Explain, interpret, create. Which type then gives a better opportunity for academic discourse in your classroom? Discourse. And that is what your point was, is that for an English classroom, for an edTPA lesson, thinking about how you're going to show engagement, you need to think about in terms of discourse, not syntax. Because syntax is applying rules. Unless you're going to discuss the rules, and I'm not sure really there's much discussion about rules. That's the whole point of rules. There's no discussion. Okay.
Rules are meant to be changed.
They're what?
Rules are meant to be broken.
Uh-oh. Says the librarian. Okay, so let's practice. Here's a language objective. The learner will argue for or against prohibition in a debate. What's the language function in this objective? Argue. What's the language product in this objective? Debate. Is it discourse or syntax? Discourse. There's nothing to indicate here that the purpose has to do with the rules of a debate. Oh, there are some. And that would be a lesson. So you can do that. Now, this is the thing. If you can identify the difference between discourse and syntax, that's the hardest part. That's the one that gets everybody all bent out of shape. If you can do that, that's good as easy peasy. And that's why if all you do in your edTPA is discuss vocabulary, you're only going to get a 2, because they know that's easy peasy. Everybody ought to be able to identify the vocabulary used in their lesson. So it's just barely an expectation for an emerging person. But for a proficient, that's different. Okay, I want you to write your language objective. I think you all did that, didn't you? Okay. All right. Step 4 is identifying the vocabulary. I have students work on the vocabulary last, because if you'll notice, people want to talk about 2 types of vocabulary. I don't call them the same thing as everybody else. I talk about vocabulary that addresses the content. So if I'm teaching about prohibition, we're going to have to know about the 18th Amendment, the 21st Amendment, the temperance movement, speakeasies, bootlegging, there's a lot. Maybe not in one lesson, but it's part of the greater conversation. If I'm focusing on a debate or argue, then I've got some vocabulary that is needed for them to understand how to take care of the function, argue, and the product, debate. So I have my students think in terms of vocabulary that's going to address the content and vocabulary that's needed for the function or the product. That makes sense?
Like 1 for 1.
There does not have, so as a teacher, you decide these things. I will tell you that I advise my students to keep to have a low number. This might be for an entire learning segment, not one lesson. How many words do you think a student can learn in one lesson? Remember and use. 5 or 6, I think, would be a max. For them to actually be able to use the word and apply it, I think that's generous. We don't learn words by writing the definitions, because if we did, I would be a genius, because I was that kid that always did the assignment and wrote the definitions, and I don't remember a single one. Not a one. I'm 59 years old, I don't remember a single definition that I've written. That's bad. How does a child that's 2 years old learning to speak, how do they learn to speak? How do they get that first word? They mimic, they say it, and they get feedback. People learn language in context, so you should be teaching vocabulary within the context of your lesson. Don't just introduce the words at the beginning of the lesson and expect the students to be able to use them. Teach them as you come upon them. But when you're talking about the vocabulary that you're going to use in a lesson, or you're going to emphasize in a lesson, think in terms of what kind of vocabulary that you need in order to complete the function, complete the product, and address the content. And it could be that you don't need both types, or all these types. It could be that you only need vocabulary from the content, or you only need vocabulary from the function or product. You decide that by thinking about the purpose of your language task. You have to think about what you're doing. So these are just examples. See if you can come up with some vocabulary. What you need for function or product, and what you need to address the content.
I think you're wrong. Certain what do you mean?
Okay. Are there any questions about that before we move on? Well, what I want to do next is look at actually the most important part. Not the hardest part, really, but the most important part. Let me tell you something about academic language. Academic language is important because it's the equalizer in your classroom. When everyone has the ability and shares the same language, they understand what's being said. Have you had the experience of being at a dinner with guys talking about sports cars or NASCAR or football, something that you're completely uninterested in? Or if Dr. Hogan and I are out to dinner with our two fellas and we start talking about school and we're using this jargon they don't understand, are they part of the conversation? No. But if everybody becomes part of the conversation because they have been given keys to the language, it's an equalizer. It makes your classroom content and learning more equally accessible to your students. So it's a big deal. And don't let people tell you that academic language is just a stupid thing that edTPA came up with. It's not. It's research-based. That it is the biggest determination of how well students are going to learn. Their access to be able to understand the academic language. Now, you all know from teaching that some students are going to learn very differently. And so one way that you can't just put the vocabulary out there, you can't just say, here's the words, look them up and write the definition. You have to do more than that. You have to support your students in learning. And so that is what makes the difference between someone who can just identify this stuff and someone who knows how to help their students actually use it. And that's how you get up to be more than proficient, but an advanced level beginning teacher. So we're going to look at task 1, prompt 4. And let's just look at what it says. Remember how I told you they ask about the function first? So this is from, probably it looks like it's from an English one.
No, it's math.
Is this the math? No, it's not, so they'd list the mathematical precision.
Right. That's an error.
Oh, okay, maybe it's an old one.
No, they made it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, this is, oh, I see, it says right up there, thank you. Oh, this is the elementary math. This is the elementary math, yes.
Okay.
I used the elementary math for this. So this is language function, identify one language function. Listed are, this is your samples. These are sample, they give you sample functions, guys. So you could, the smart thing would be like to choose one of those, right? I mean, that's what I do. My mama didn't raise nobody. And so, 4A, choose one function. And look what the verb says, identify. Does it say describe or explain? Please don't describe or explain when you don't need to describe or explain. Or you will describe and explain yourself right into a hole. If it says identify, identify. So, write a simple statement identifying the function. The language function of this learning task is interpret. That is all you have to write for 4A. When you get down here to 4B, identify a key learning task from your plans. That's just what we did. Identify the lesson in which the learning task occurred. Again, identify. So you could seriously write in lesson 2, students will interpret that. And that's all you need for that. 4C, here they want you to describe. Now we got the describe. And that's where most of your effort needs to be. Describe the following associated language demands, written or oral, that students need to understand or use. So here you're going to talk about the vocabulary that they need, plus at least one of the following. So I take an X and mark out that at least, plus one of the following, syntax or discourse. Do not do both. And so here's how I tell my students to write it. And I'm telling you folks, I showed this to the National edTPA director, and she says this is a support that tells them how to write, not what to write, and it's totally acceptable support. So don't worry about it. I've already vetted it. Paragraph 1. About the syntax or discourse, only one of these. Give the details on either your discourse or syntax. Describe how the function is used in the syntax or discourse. Paragraph 2, about the vocabulary. Identify the vocabulary needed to complete the learning task. Describe how it supports the function. Describe how the vocabulary is used to support that. That covers that question. The biggest part of that entire rubric, though, rubric 4, has to do with language supports. Look, just being able to identify stuff is just going to get you a 2. You have to start talking about supports now. And the supports are big. Sorry, pressed the wrong thing. We've got general supports, targeted supports, and individual supports. And you'll notice those are on your lesson plan template, and they're there for a reason. General supports, targeted supports, what am I hitting? And individual supports. These are what gets you a level 3, 4, and 5 on the edTPA rubric 4. Now, don't worry, all this stuff will be available to you next semester. But it just kind of gives you an idea about how you organize and write for the edTPA that's coming up. This is all for 4D. It's very important, instructors, that your students know the difference between general support, targeted support, and supports for individuals and groups. So let's talk about what the difference is. General supports are supports that are generally available to students, all the time. They've not been designed for a specific thing. They're word walls, they're anchor charts, they're glossaries, they're notes. They're available, and they've not been specifically designed for a specific thing. A targeted support is a support that has been specifically designed, created, gathered, found, stolen from another teacher, that supports students, not particular students, but a particular demand. Now, this is important when you're scoring those lesson plans. The difference between a targeted support and an individual support has to do with the fact that they are supposed to be targeting demands, not students. So they need to actually say things like, in order to support the function of compare and contrast, my students will be using a Venn diagram. In order to support the vocabulary, my students have a word bank. In order to support the discourse and essay, I'm going to provide an outline. Other examples, graphic organizers, sentence stems, models, representations. Now, individual supports are supports that you have specifically designed and created for people, humans. It might be a specific one student or a specific group of students. So you might have students paired, reader, non-reader. You might allow voice to text. And when you're trying to decide what they're going to struggle with, think about, you're asking them to listen. Do any of your students have trouble with listening? Because I found that no American students have any trouble with listening. None of them. They're all perfect at listening, right? Yeah, I live in another world, don't I? American students suck at listening. Terrible at it. So yes, you have listening problems. That's language. Reading. Do you have people who struggle with reading? The higher you go up, the more you got. Because you've got big differences in their reading ability when the higher you go up in the age. Reading. Do you have some who just can't seem to write? And speak. Some that are painfully shy, maybe. Some that actually have speech problems. Some who have expressive speech problems. So you have to start thinking about all of the different ways people could struggle with language in your classroom. And there are a ton of them, so there's no excuse not to be able to identify somebody. Everybody should be able to identify at least one student struggling with language. And it doesn't have to be ELL or ESL. I wish we'd just take that out of the equation, but we have to have it because you do have those students. But if you're planning for anybody who has trouble with language, that's going to help ESL and ELL. So you're not off the hook because you don't have ELL or ESL, whatever you're calling it. Yeah.
A question my students ask me, if you use a support with the whole class, because the whole class benefits, but it is especially beneficial to a group or individual such as struggling reader.
Then it's an individual support.
All right.
Because the purpose of having that support is for students that struggle with that thing, even though you want to give it to the whole person. In a secondary classroom, you've got 30 kids. You've got 3 that can't take notes. You're not going to give just those 3 students a graphic organizer for notes, because that would be too obvious to the students and it would be terrible to do to their self-esteem. You're going to take that graphic organizer, you're going to make 30 copies of it, and you want to distribute it to everybody. That way, you're supporting those 3 students, and everybody gets the benefit from it. Same with the elementary classroom. There's no reason why these good things that you provide for people who struggle can't be used for everybody, unless it's one-on-one. And that's not going to work. It's not reasonable. Common errors. Teacher candidates have identified they have a tendency to get graphic organizers mixed up. They want to call them syntax when actually they're supports. It's really important to remember that a syntax that means it's a final product. A support helps them get there. When a teacher candidate uses a graphic organizer, they have to ask themselves, is this the final product of a learning task? Or does it support them in creating another product? So let's say that they're planning to compare, like I said, Hitler and Mussolini. The Venn diagram, of course, is a support, not a syntax. See if you can come up with a few general targeted individual supports. And these are the sentence stems that are important so that you as instructors looking at lesson plans know when students should not just put word wall or word bank. They need to say, in order to support students with their vocabulary, I will provide a word bank for this lesson. So this is the type of sentence stem that will make the difference between someone getting a 2, 3, or 4 on their rubrics. And 3 is proficient. That's where we want to be, and there's no reason why we shouldn't be there. General supports, what are those? Give me an example of general support.
Word wall.
Word wall. Targeted. Textbook. Textbooks, general. Targeted. What about targeted support? Word bank. As long as it's not something that's up on the wall all the time. It's something that you have created specifically for this lesson.
Teacher modeling.
Teacher modeling, yes.
Sentence stems.
Sentence stems. What are some individual supports? Why am I lost my thing? I'm so sad. What are some individual supports? What are some ways you can support people with listening?
Guided notes.
Guided notes. Any other ideas? I love that one. Well, I'm recording this.
Video, audio.
Recording lessons, allowing people to listen to them again. Having your lesson in chunks so that you're not talking for an hour and a half at one time. You're talking in 10 minutes. 10 minutes, activity. 10 minutes, activity. People can do that before they can do 100 minutes. Chunking your lessons.
An anchor chart or something.
Anchor chart is usually a general support unless it's being created for that particular lesson. So again, the teacher who's writing the plan is deciding what these things are. But you are, when you're writing this up, you need to think, am I supporting my students enough? And if you aren't, this is your opportunity to put supports in there and make your learning more equitable in the classroom. You're teaching.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
One of the things that I notice that happens quite frequently is that many times students feel like extended time and additional questioning, rephrasing the questioning, are sufficient individual supports. How do you feel about that?
I feel that they should be allowed to write that down one time the whole semester.
Thank you.
Because that's not showing much imagination. And I know your students can do better than that. And they need to do better than that. They need to look at Pinterest. Good Lord. There's so much good stuff on Pinterest. Where was Pinterest when I I was teaching elementary, I would have spent a fortune. But yeah, there's a ton. Think what you can do. You can, if a high school teacher can think of something, surely to God you elementary folks can. No offense to the high school folks. There's a few of you in here. No offense. But this is your major. All right, so use some imagination, look into it. So yeah, those of you who are supervising say, well, now wait a minute, you used that last time. Let's come up with something different. All right, so when you're writing this up, this is my support. That's a targeted support that I provide my students in residency too. Paragraph 1, describe the supports for your function. How did you help your students understand, develop, and use the function? Paragraph 2, describe the supports for your vocabulary. Paragraph 3, describe the supports for your syntax or discourse. And then paragraph 4, describe any supports that are designed for specific language needs of any specific students or groups of students. So here's some examples. So people always kind of want to know what the edTPA looks like. Here's someone's answer for 4A. This is a science, middle grade science, I think. My language function is explain. Key learning task, 4B. There's somebody's answer to 4C. Notice how they've bolded and underlined. Why do you think they did that?
Point the reviewer's nose right at the answer.
Exactly. Have you ever hidden Easter eggs for 2-year-olds? How do you do that? You lay it right here and say, oh my, I wonder where the Easter egg is. Your evidence that you want your scorer to see, pretend it is Easter eggs and your scores are 2-year-olds. Underline the important words and bold them. There's no rule against it, and it helps. It also makes you aware of what you're doing. This is somebody's 4D. Notice it says, you can talk about prior instruction when you're talking about your supports to help the students develop language demands. I provide the students with graphic organizer, includes a phrase. Anyway, so these are some of the answers that we've gotten. This is another one. This one is a math, I think. Rubric 14. Now, one of the things that you need to do, and folks, our rubric 14 is not that good, and I have a theory that it's because people don't plan for it. They're all hyped up. They know they got to videotape these lessons, and they know they've got to get these certain behaviors, but what they forget to videotape is the language. Because in task 3, in the middle of all that stuff about their assessment, they have to come up with evidence of academic language use. So you need to have a video clip that's for academic language use. It can be an additional file that you label language use. It can't be any more than 5 minutes. Or it needs to be part of the video clips that you have for task 2. Or it could be part of the student work samples that you have for task 3. But you need to plan for that. And once you plan for that, you'll do better.
Okay, can I ask a couple of questions?
Yeah.
My students get a little confused. So I'm just going to ask you what they asked me. Does it have to be the same language function as in 4?
There is no checking.
No checking.
They do not check. They do not require scores to check to see, and there's no place on the rubric. It's not a condition code, and it's not part of the rubric.
Does it not have to be the same learning task?
No.
But it has to be language use, and they have to use the same concepts as demand, function.
Yes. Okay. It needs to be from the lessons, the learning segment, yeah. But it doesn't have to be the language task that they described in 4, task 1, 4. It doesn't have to be. Because there's no there's no way that is scored. There's no place where a scorer is asked to double check that.
It's gone.
Yeah, it's gone. So it's not important. They just need to have a good academic language sample. So be thinking about that when you videotape. Yes?
I have a question about lesson planning and the difference between an academic or language objective and a learning objective.
Yes. Thank you for bringing that up. Your language objectives, remember in the academic language section of your lesson plan, what you're doing is analyzing and describing the academic language that's demanded in your lesson. So that language objective, in my mind, does not have to be one of the learning objectives, especially if you're not assessing it.
But it could be?
It could be, yes. So if you're going to have an assessment, then I would put it as one of the objectives. But it could be that the language that you're using, people are just practicing language. And it could be that your lesson doesn't really focus on assessing formally or informally any of the, so there's a lot of reasons why you might not want to include it as a learning objective. So the language objective that goes in the academic language section lesson plan does not have to be one of your learning objectives, but it can be. You have to be thinking about your lesson. What are you trying to get accomplished? What's the way to get to the end? What you're looking for.
Terryl, I have a question too. A lot of times I've found that if you really look at your standard, you can find your language.
You are so right.
In that standard. They've got that verb kind of just staring at you.
Yes.
So
you are so right.
With that said though, I have a hard time too, like
so if your standard is something like identify, and you're really wanting to go beyond that with your language, then just use another higher order verb that fits. So, if you've got students that already have a handle, but you're really wanting to take them up further in blooms, then it's perfectly fine to use a different verb that's what's in the standard.
It's okay to use the verb in the standard.
Yes, it is. As long as it's not a performance. Yeah. It needs to be a brainy verb. Okay, this is what, there are two academic language rubrics, 4 and 14. When you get ready to write 14, it's just a matter of describing the student's use of language function, the student's use of vocabulary, and student's use of discourse or syntax. So you want to have evidence of students actually using those things, either on video or on a work sample. And the more evidence you have of different language, the higher you score. If you provide evidence of having something special designed for students with varied needs, you get even more. And does everybody have students with varied needs? Please don't say not applicable. If you've got an entire class of gifted kids, you still have differences among those gifted students. There are always differences. So, to get a 4, it's function, vocabulary, syntax, discourse, and it's all within how you explain it with your content. So just a good explanation of that, how it applies with what you're teaching. And then adding in language needs is how you get the 5. So this is what it looks like. Somebody can't see how they've done it. So they have actually organized it so easily. Their Easter eggs are just right there. As a scorer, I would love this because it would make it so easy to find the evidence instead of hunting around for it. Those are my happy students from last year where they finished their edTPA. That's going to be you in March when you upload it. Yay! You recognize anybody? We will have another workshop workshop, if you'd like to come, on October the 12th. We're going to look at the diversity that's woven all the way through all the tasks. And then on November the 16th, we're going to look very carefully at task 2, because that's where our scores are the lowest, task 2. So I think what we need to have is an understanding of what is required in task 2. There's nothing wrong with our instruction. What's wrong is what we're videotaping. We're not videotaping the right things. We're videotaping everything, but the behaviors that we need are too spread apart. They're further than 10 minutes apart. So we need to take a look at task 2 and figure out how we're going to do a better job at showcasing stuff that I know you all know to do, okay? So, thank you very much. I am available for questions if you have any.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question.
Okay.
Are you gonna do this for secondary folks or have you?
I've already done it.
All right. So,
Ms. Rock, you look up here a minute.
I'm gonna hit it again. I'm gonna hit it again Monday.
Thank you. Good.
Can I have your PowerPoint?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am. Are you